This is StoryBeat, Storytellers on Storytelling, an exploration into how master storytellers and artists develop and build brilliant stories and works of art that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators of all kinds find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University in the heart of downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Bill Eisler, is President Emeritus of Fred Rogers Productions and a longtime educator and advocate for children. He began his career as a teacher and administrator and later joined the Pennsylvania Department of Education, where he served as executive assistant to the Secretary of Education, Commissioner of Basic Education, and senior program advisor for early childhood education before joining Fred Rogers Productions in 1984. In 2005, he was named the executive director of the Fred Rogers Center, a position he held until 2008. During his years at Fred Rogers Productions, Bill helped bring to life lovable characters such as Daniel Tiger. He worked on the iconic TV show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and under Bill's leadership, Fred Rogers Productions produced 3 PBS Kids hit series, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, Peg and Cat, and Odd Squad, which have garnered a combined 17 Daytime Emmy Awards to date. In addition to serving on the board of Fred Rogers Productions, Bill is a member of numerous boards and councils, including 16 years on the board of Pittsburgh Public Schools, serving as president for 5 years. Bill has received numerous awards, including, in 2017, the prestigious PBS Be More Award for Excellence in Children's Media. And on top of all that, Bill Eisler is currently portrayed by Enrico Colantoni in the feature film A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, starring Tom Hanks as Fred Rogers. So for me, it's a big thrill and a truly wonderful honor to have one of the great men of television, especially children's programming, Bill Eisler, as my guest on StoryBeat today. Bill, welcome to the show.
Steve, thank you, and you're very kind for that introduction, but you know how excited I was. I mean, I think we have to tell people we literally ran into each other in the street in the Strip District, and I couldn't believe it was you because I hadn't seen you for a couple of years. I mean, you are one impressive human being, and it's great to have you back in the city full time.
The kindness is all on you.
I know. It's good.
All right, so let's go back to a little bit of the beginnings. What first got you inspired to work with children and we'll talk about how you got to children's programming, but you started off in children's education.
I did.
How did you get there?
I was teaching school, and this was in the late 60s, and I decided to go to law school. I quit teaching. I got drafted. When I came back out of the Army, I debated on whether to go into law school or the School of Social Work. And a good friend of mine who was running a human service program in the Mon Valley asked if I would come down and consult on children's programming because of my background. He then hired me and convinced me that what I should do is go into child development at Pitt, and I did. And that's where I met Margaret McFarland, who was Fred Rogers' chief consultant.
Right.
So, this is just a trajectory that was very serendipitous, being at the right place at the right time and meeting the right people.
A lot of creative people that have been on this show have said similar things, that life is this weird chain, this link of chain.
Absolutely.
That goes on, and it is serendipity to a certain amount.
It is. Fred used to call it weaving the quilt.
Weaving the quilt.
Now, that's what life was. You were really a weaver.
Wow.
And it was the threads that held everything together.
I love that image. I mean, that's a powerful image.
It is a powerful
image. Because quilts are very frequently many different things.
Right. And I think our lives, I mean, again, look at the two of us. I mean, I've spent most of my time here. You've been all over the place, but long time in L.A. and come back. We have been a lot of places and done a lot of things.
That's
so the quilts are pretty colorful.
Oh, and really you don't appreciate it till you get down the road a little bit.
Exactly.
Right? Because when you're in your 20s, there's not much of a quilt there.
Right.
But when you get to a little bit older and you've done a little bit of stuff, that quilt gets to be, wow, look back at that. And I try to keep looking forward, as I know you do too.
Right. There's a painting in your history on this, a good one.
I'm sure there is. Okay, so how did you eventually get? I mean, you're doing all this stuff in children's education. How did you eventually get to Fred Rogers?
Well, I met Fred when I was in graduate school, which was in the early 70s, because Margaret McFarland introduced me. We stayed in contact. I went, left Pittsburgh, went to Harrisburg. We stayed in contact. When Fred would come to Harrisburg or Hershey, primarily for the Pennsylvania Public Television Network or any public television events, we would get together. And at one point, he asked in the early 80s if I would think about coming back to Pittsburgh, and I initially said no, that I really like state government. I love working for Dick Thornburg and in the Thornburg administration. I love the things we were doing in education, and especially in early childhood education. And I said no, and then the more I thought about it, and the person I was directly responsible to, Bob Wilburn, who was Secretary of Education, said, you're going to get one chance in life to work with Fred Rogers, and this is it, so you better take it.
Well, yeah,
and I did.
That was very wise advice you got.
It was great advice. I mean, it's advice that if it wasn't for Bob and him saying that to me, I don't think I would have come back to Pittsburgh.
Yeah, interesting. And so it wasn't just the pull of Mr. Rogers. It was someone saying it to you.
Oh, absolutely. And reminding me what an opportunity it could be.
In storytelling, a character like that would be called a mentor.
Right.
Now, this gentleman may not have been your mentor, but he was giving you mentoring advice at that moment.
He was a mentor. I mean, still to this day, we're still in good contact together today. So did you then have to get some kind? Talk about what you did for Fred Rogers all those years. What did you do in the beginning, and how did it evolve? It's funny because I always say it was the non-creative part. It was really the administrative part of the organization. The company at the time was called Family Communications because Fred did not want it named after him. He wanted it to be bigger than Fred Rogers,
right.
So it was Family Communications. He wanted to have somebody who could deal with the day-to-day administrative responsibilities of running a company and running a media company, and to really bring people in, creative people who could do more.
Sure.
And it was a very creative staff that he had really built over the years, and we continued to build that staff. But my job was really administrative. I was purely in the administrative end of it and leaving the creative to everybody else.
Did you get involved in any of the creative stuff ever?
Yeah, I did. I mean, a lot of the proposal writing, when we would come up with ideas, we would be starting new programs or not necessarily television programs, but we would be doing programs to help people who were working with children in the medical fields, in the child care field, in elementary education. We did a lot of pretty unique programs over the years, video related.
I'm trying to remember. You have producing credits on these shows, don't you?
I really don't. I'm very different about credits. I always say, who sees the credits?
Well, that's true.
And the other line that somebody gave me years ago was, it's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't want to take credit. And Fred and I would exchange that all the time. So no, my name would appear places, but I really never went after the credits.
Okay, but you were actually behind the scenes. You were
behind
producing.
The scenes, very much so.
You were deeply involved. Would you be on set as well?
Always.
Always.
Yeah.
So you really were essentially minding the mint, as they say, and running the show.
Right, but
it was his show, clearly.
Right. He was really the talent, but we had tremendous producers. And we really had good people in that studio.
Okay, so this is what I was trying to get to. Is where did you learn that from?
I pretty much learned it by being there.
Just doing it.
Yeah, just seeing people do it. I mean, I would not consider myself a producer and in no way a director, but in watching people and watching how things are put together. I mean, the producer does everything, and once the door's closed, the director takes over. I mean, you know this field far better than I do.
Yeah.
And we had very, very talented people, very gifted people.
Oh, well, that's obvious. How many episodes did
there were over 900.
No, is that all? Just 900 episodes?
Amazing?
That's an awesome number of episodes for any series, and for it clearly it had to be people that knew what they were doing.
Absolutely.
All right. So, did you then develop perhaps producing heroes? Anybody that you looked around in the world and you said, "I really admire what they're doing. I'm going to emulate or steal from them," perhaps.
That's really interesting. I think that the neighborhood was so unique.
That's true.
And Fred was so unique. And it really had grown into a very iconic children's program.
Before
that other
you came on
children's
board.
programs drew from the neighborhood. I mean, let me just, if I may, just come a little bit ahead of it, if you don't mind. If we can just go a little bit ahead. If you take a look at Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, which was created by Angela Santamero. Angela Santamero created Blue's Clues.
Okay.
For Nickelodeon.
Yeah.
She grew up with a neighborhood. she had a facilitator working with the animation and the puppets, and she had a teenage facilitator, a younger person. But there was a lot of similarities between Blue's Clues and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Sure.
So what I'm getting at there is that the iconic nature of how Fred created that program and how he appealed directly to children. You have another great creative writer and producer of children's programs, and Angela Santamera, who we worked with in the development of Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood.
Right.
So when you say, did we steal from anything, I think what we knew we had something very unique.
Well, I guess that's really true, because Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood started in what year? 1965?
1968. Well, yes. It started in Canada. Then he brought it into Pittsburgh. It was on WTAE for a year, and then he moved over to QED in about 67.
He was essentially, I mean, it wasn't the very beginning of TV as we know it, but it was close to it.
Right. You're a little bit younger than I am, but I grew up with the Children's Corner in the 50s.
Sure.
Which was Fred Rogers and Josie Carey
on
WQED.
I remember Josie Carey.
Okay, so Josie was on air. Fred was behind the scenes doing all the puppets and the music.
I remember Ricky and Copper.
Do you really?
I remember Paul Shannon.
Oh, yeah, so do I. That's great. And Hank Stoll.
Of course.
We're
Popeye
going back.
and Knish.
We're going back. Yeah, we're going back.
That's really going back.
That's
and
wild.
most of the audience right now said, "Who are these guys talking about?" and have gone out to get a drink of water. The point is that he was setting it up well before you got involved.
Oh, much before.
And so you came into a rolling train.
Yeah, absolutely. I came into a very successful, nationally known program and a company that was nationally known and really very much respected by PBS.
So how long had you known Mr. Rogers? You'd met him in?
I met him in about 73, 74.
So it was 11 years.
Yeah, it was about 10 or 11 years before I came back to Pittsburgh.
So he wasn't hiring you out of the blue.
No.
You had a relationship already.
Had a relationship. He knew what I was doing. He knew my background in child development.
One thing that I know about the entertainment industry at large is that it really is not so much about what you know, but who you know. And so I think that's a good case in point.
But isn't that life? It's all about relationships.
It really is.
If I wouldn't have seen you on the street, I wouldn't be here today.
Exactly.
We knew each other. We met each other.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden, we run into each other. It's all about relationships.
It really is. And particularly in that industry.
Yep.
I know that in Los Angeles and Hollywood or New York, it's really that connection to other
Absolutely.
people. And I'm sure it's the same way for you all. Although, curiously enough, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood wasn't working out of the big markets. You're working in a little bit isolated way by being here in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, in many ways, I think that was good.
I think it was a big plus.
And funny when you would say that, you say that when Fred would be getting off a plane in Pittsburgh, they would say, "How long are you going to be in Pittsburgh?" Because they didn't think, he said, "Well, I live and work here." You do? You're not Hollywood? You said, "No, we're Pittsburgh."
Were you totally familiar with his work prior to all that?
Very much so.
Okay, so it wasn't a revelation to you that he was doing this kind of work.
Oh no, not at all. I mean, again, having studied child development and being interested in quality for children, he really did set the standard.
I think that's accurate.
So we studied Fred, and we looked at what Fred did.
Mm-hmm.
And Pittsburgh has quite a reputation in early childhood. If you take a look at, I mentioned Margaret McFarland at the Arsenal Family and Children's Center, which was part of the University of Pittsburgh.
Right.
She worked with Ben Spock, who wrote Baby and Child Care, and
Sure.
Eric Erickson, who wrote Childhood and Society. So the biggest and the best were in Pittsburgh.
Benjamin Spock was in Pittsburgh?
He worked at the University of Pittsburgh.
I did not know that.
In fact, he did a lot of his research here, as did Eric Erickson.
How interesting. I don't know why I didn't know that, but I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. He and Margaret were very... The great story is that they would do a lot of observation at the Arsenal Family and Children's Center, which was in the Arsenal at Lawrenceville.
Right.
It was the old Navy Arsenal. They took an old home, what was for 2 Navy officers, took the middle lot, created a house, put in preschool classrooms. They had offices, and they would observe children and talk during the day, and in the afternoon when they would be going back to the university, they would stop at the Pleasure Bar in Bloomfield. And Margaret would tell the story that Eric and Ben would have scotch, she'd have sherry, and they would talk more about kids.
Interesting. I'm off topic a little bit, but I'm just curious. You brought it up. Did Dr. Spock and Mr. Rogers know one another?
They had met.
They had met,
and Fred had seen him in Cleveland, and they were both talking about Margaret. Because both of them had benefited from her knowledge.
Wow.
in child development.
That
Pretty amazing.
that's very heady when you think about it, because those are two legends in children's
very much so
development.
And Eric Erickson in the psychoanalytic field, when they did a 25th anniversary for Fred being on children's television, Erickson came back to speak, which was really something to have him come to Pittsburgh. Because at that time he was pretty old and not doing much traveling.
All right, so you worked with Fred Rogers for how many years then?
About 35.
35 years, just a few.
Yeah, just a few.
All right, so I'm curious. Speak to one or two or three things that you learned from him about the world, about TV, about children. Tell us what you learned from him.
Well, what I learned I'll give you three that one of which I'm still working on to this day. Hard. One is the importance of patience. Fred was an incredibly patient human being.
Was there anybody ever more patient?
It's a great comment. It's funny because I was watching with my 2-year-old grandson today, Daniel Tiger, and one of the little songs that Angela developed is, when you feel so mad you want to roar, take a deep breath and count to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I use that every time I'm in the car. It just, you got to remember to take the deep breath. And so the patience, to realize that not everybody is going to be able to go at the same pace as you, or that, people aren't doing things just to get to you. Just be patient. So patience is a big thing.
Did you ever see him become impatient?
Yeah, in the studio, if he didn't feel people were giving it their all and giving it their best, you would see him get into a zone where, this is important. That's about as much as he would push it. This is really important. We have to get this done correctly. So yes, his work was very, very central to who he was.
So I can't picture him ever yelling at anybody.
He would not yell. I've never heard him yell.
But he'd become pointed.
He would come pointed and say, "Look, let's get this right. Let's clear the studio and only have the people in here we need to have, and let's get this done and let's do it right."
So he knew how to take charge of the room.
Oh, did he ever? It was as all the directors would say. This is not Mr. Eisler's neighborhood. This is Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. We know whose neighborhood it is.
Well, I think that would be accurate.
Yeah,
it would be pretty hard to beat him back on that.
Right.
But it's very interesting that he practiced what he preached.
He did. The other thing, one of the other things is to listen. And Fred listened. And again, I find myself, if we would be eating somewhere in a restaurant, I may not be focusing on you 100%. You're looking around.
Sure.
Fred focused on you 100%. He listened to you. What he was interested in at the time is what you had to say, not everybody else.
Well, as this recent movie, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, came out, I read many articles about Mr. Rogers and, of course, the movie and so on. But you're talking about one of the things that I saw repeatedly is that he had the ability, which I think very few people have, to make the entire world about you,
right?
You, the listener, and that apparently he was incredibly gifted at, as someone would ask him a question about him, he would turn around and make it about them.
Always. I used to call that as verbal karate.
Verbal karate.
Because you would meet him, and right away he would be interested in how Steve got to be who he is today, and why you're doing things the way you're doing them. And he especially loved to have those conversations with younger people who were in school.
Well, that makes sense.
And really learning. So he focused on the person all the time. And amazing to me. Just as an example, when you know what book signings are like.
Sure.
You've been through this.
Of course.
And you go into a bookstore and they have a quota for you to sign every hour. And Fred would give him an hour, and 15 minutes into it, the people would come up and say, he's got to move on. And I'm sorry, he's not going to do it. He's not going to. Somebody would come up and say, "You made a difference in my life," and then the conversation would start.
Would he hang around much longer than?
Oh
he was
yeah,
scheduled?
He would. He would. He very. One of the things I did a lot in traveling with him was try to keep him moving. And you had to apologize to people and say, he has a schedule. He has to get here. He has to get there. But you always had to pull him away.
You were responsible for taking him around then.
David Newell, who was head of PR, and I both did it.
David's been on the show.
David's been on the show, but I really was in a sense, the no person. Let's just keep moving.
So just for the audience's sake who may be listening to this and had not heard the David Newell episode, David Newell played Mr. McFeely
yeah,
for
he was.
however 50
Forever.
years.
Yeah, no, he was
still
there
does play Mr. McFeely.
Still does Mr. McFeely. Yes, he does.
And one of, I mean, I can't imagine a nicer person than David Newell.
David doesn't have a bad bone in his
Not
body.
exactly
I mean, he's
right.
really one kind human being.
So I mean, that had to have been completely symbiotic between the two of them. Because if he'd come in and been an unpleasant person, then he probably wouldn't have been Mr. McFeely for long.
Right. And David was the same way. When David was doing an appearance as Mr. McFeely, he would spend hours. Mm-hmm. And he would be there until the last person left.
Do you think that's David, or do you think he learned that from Mr. Rogers?
I think a lot of that is David, but I think a lot of that was learned from Fred and being with Fred over the years.
So he was everything that we saw on camera, off camera.
As we would say, what you see is what you got. There was no difference between Fred Rogers and Mr. Rogers, or Mr. Rogers and Fred Rogers.
And he was curious about everything.
He was curious about every possible thing that went on in life.
Well, that's the hallmark of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, is how many things he was, exploring.
Obviously. And again, I love how you just said it, exploring, because people would say, I love when you go to the factories to see how things are made. Mm-hmm. And Fred would always say, I'm glad you like to see how people make things. Because when we get back to the relationship, you get back to people. So it's people who are making those things, and he would always emphasize that.
I think you're hitting on maybe the singular major lesson of Mr. Rogers, which is it's never about you, it's about everyone else.
All right, and here's number 3.
Okay.
He never used a personal pronoun.
Never used I or me.
People would say, I love your program, and he would always say, I'm glad you can use our work.
Wow.
It was amazing to me. It was the team approach. The people in his life were what was central, and without them, he couldn't do the work he did.
That's amazing.
And he remained close. I mean, if you saw the documentary, in Nikki Tallow, who was on the stage crew, Jimmy Seach, Frank Werninski, these people were as important to Fred as anybody else in his life.
They were his family.
They were his family. They were, as Joanne said, they were his playmates.
They're his playmates. That's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have to assume that he had an inordinately playful mind.
Oh, very, very.
That I don't want to say it wasn't.
Love the way you said that. He was. He liked to play.
And he was not childish. He was childlike.
Like very childlike. Major difference. Not childish. Childlike.
It's totally different.
Right.
I talk about that in classes that I teach. There's a big difference.
Absolutely.
For instance, right now I'm teaching a course on TV animation writing, and I say you want to approach subjects for young children in a childlike way, not in a childish way.
Right. And as adults, we should remain childlike, not childish.
Well,
right?
There are all too many adults, I believe, who lose whatever they had as a child, and I think it's sorrowful that they lose it.
It is. I mean, what you lose is you lose your sense of wonder, you lose your sense of imagination, you lose your sense of creativity. And when you're teaching, especially in a course on animation, children's animation, that's what it's all about.
It's exactly what it's all about.
You got to let your mind go.
Well, one of the things that I do teach that obviously he would totally back is that I never talk down to anyone in a script that I've written. I'm always writing it for... My philosophy was always to write it for me and what I would enjoy, and just take the adult parts of it so that that's not in there. And you don't talk about adult topics. You don't talk about in a child's animation. You're not going to talk about high finance on Wall Street. That's just not likely to be a topic you bring up.
Exactly.
But you can talk about what it's like not to have money.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. The proof of what you're saying to me is when people would say to me, I couldn't stand a neighborhood until I had kids. I never understood it.
Well,
they would see it. They wouldn't see it as an adult.
Sure.
And once they saw it through the eyes of a child,
right,
it totally made sense to them.
Yeah, because as an adult, Mr. Rogers was kind of talking on a level that most adults would be impatient with, but a kid would be totally patient with.
Totally. I can't believe. I mean, I want to go back to my grandson because, my granddaughter is 5, but they now watch Mr. Rogers. They stream Mr. Rogers. So it's not. Or a lot of people said, well, it's a program of the 70s. It's a program of the 60s. Children today still want something that they can understand and appreciate and like, and you don't have to have a lot of fast movement and a lot of action.
Well, here's the curious thing about children. They're always going to be children.
Always.
And
got it.
And one of the beauty parts of writing or producing for children is your audience keeps turning over every few years, and it's this, you got a whole brand new batch of people of eyeballs that will appreciate your work.
Absolutely.
You know, it doesn't really grow old.
Exactly.
And I have to imagine that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood has not grown old at all.
It really hasn't. I mean, what is different on some of the how people make things. A lot of things today may be animated. There may be bigger machines, but people are still central to getting those things to work and getting the final product out the door. But
Absolutely.
we laugh every once in a while when we see something because, again, if it was produced in the late 60s
Yes.
in black and white, it's a little bit different today.
Well, that's true. The imagery has a different patina to it.
Exactly.
It just has and of course you're seeing a person age over time
Right.
too. So if
Oh,
you're
yeah.
seeing the beginning
Oh,
of
yeah.
Mr. Rogers' career and the end of his career, he looks like Mr. Rogers, only he's aged.
Right. That's true.
And I think that to children don't know the difference in terms of if you've aged or not. They just know adult, father,
Right.
grandfather,
Right.
that sort of thing.
Right. They see adult. You're right.
So I guess what you're saying is that the real secret is about listening and putting the emphasis on the other.
It is, always. And you do that when you teach.
Do you know, well, you do have to do it when you
Right.
teach. Do you know that that's really the same principle that all actors work with? That when they're acting, the one thing that all great actors do is once they concentrate on the other characters, they take themselves out of the equation, and that frees them up to be loose and limber.
It's amazing.
And so it's the same principle in action that you're talking about. And yes, as a teacher, so we're sitting here today. It's whether I'm doing a good job or not, someone else would have to tell me. But my job today is to listen to you, to comment, to feedback, and so on. But I'm trying hard to listen.
Right.
And that requires, and that's the other thing that he was really good at, Mr. Rogers. He didn't just, there's a difference between hearing and listening.
Totally.
Absolutely. People with, good auditory systems can hear, but they don't always listen.
That's right.
It requires activity.
Yeah, you do. And it requires concentration.
Exactly
you have to
what
focus.
It does. Because if you don't, you're zoned out. You're paying attention to something else.
Not paying attention to anybody.
Okay, so let's talk about some other things other than Mr. Rogers himself, but in terms of working the product.
Sure.
Because after all, you were making a product.
Right.
Right. So what would you say, what advice would you give to up-and-coming creators that would help them to more successfully sell their shows?
Well, this is I want to get what I always, people say, I have an idea for a program.
Right.
And it's great. And people should have ideas. I have passion to do this. That's great. You should have that. I think where you have to be realistic is how are you going to get this before the public? I mean, I used to say to people, do you have a broadcast slot? That would always be my, do you have somebody who's going to broadcast this? Because we were thinking about a very linear television delivery system.
Right.
Today, the delivery systems are pretty wide open.
Very different.
And have you thought about all the different ways you might be able to get this out, to get some attention and get some recognition for what you're doing?
And it's harder today.
It is harder, much harder to get on broadcast television.
For sure.
And again, even a broadcast, when Amazon's trying to get into, broadcasting, they cut back drastically on children's.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's not a lot of money in children's media these days.
Right.
I mean, Disney is the premier, but even Nickelodeon is having issues. Can HBO get into it? It's always an issue. So my point is, think about the number of ways you might be able to get this before the eyes of individuals who will start talking about the program and will give the program some recognition, however that may be. I'm always amazed at numbers on YouTube, but, again, it shouldn't be just one thing. It shouldn't be just, I want to go to Nickelodeon, or I want to go to Amazon, or I want to go to Hulu. I think you have to think very broadly, and I think that you have to be very consistent and not come up with an idea and then start to chop it up and reformat it because somebody may say something to you. If you really believe in it, try to keep it your program.
And you need to know the markets, too.
Yeah, you have to.
PBS is a very different market than Nickelodeon.
Very. And again, I just want to say from the intellectual property point of view, the markets are very, very different, too. And by that, about what you're going to do for hire versus what you may own.
Right.
I mean, there are lots of issues. But to get back to your question about, what advice do you give people? Really work on what you want to do. Get it to the point that this is exactly what you want to do.
It should be your passion.
Your passion, and then start to follow it through. And it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. And as you said, and I think it's so true, it's even more difficult today.
Well, when you were beginning in TV, there were basically 4 outlets.
That's right.
ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS.
Right.
That was really basically it.
Think about that.
And cable was just starting to come on at that time in the mid-'80s. Right?
Right.
Prior to that, you go back 10 years before that, there wasn't really any kind of cable market other than they were rerunning what was out there on the broadcast network.
Exactly. And what was cable developed for? Cable was developed, and a lot of it was done in Pennsylvania to get the signal over the mountains.
Exactly right.
We didn't have 500 channels.
Exactly
and
right.
There was a study done years ago.
It was for rural neighborhoods.
It was there was a study. It's fascinating when you go back especially in Pennsylvania, in the history of cable television, because the most recognized face by preschool children in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s was Lucille Ball because of all the reruns.
Sure.
There was no new content. They were rerunning whatever was available.
Sure. That makes sense.
So today, there's so much out there. Even with PBS, I mean, PBS now has a 24-hour service.
Sure. And they all have to have that.
Absolutely.
I mean,
and plus digital.
And plus all of the internet and all the streaming and YouTube and everything else that's out there. There's an enormous fight in the business for eyeballs.
Right.
How can we get people to watch us? Me. So how do you take a gentle program like a Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood or Peg and Cat? How do you take a gentle program that's not screaming at people and get people to come to it?
Well, that's where we're lucky to be working with PBS and to have a service in this country like PBS that is willing to try things that are new and try things that are different. Odd Squad, which is a live action program that was developed by 2 individuals here and produced in Canada. I mean, that was a real risk, but live action hit. I mean, it became a hit. Kids like to see kids.
I guess that's what it boils down to. Is kids would like to see kids.
Yeah.
And Daniel Tiger is a kid.
Right.
Daniel Tiger's not an adult.
No.
And I think it's so different from a lot of the other fare that's out there.
Right.
It's not violent.
It's not, and it really, I mean, it's, Mother told me last week, and I've heard this a lot, but it was really interesting because I had an extended conversation with her. I've learned to be a better parent by watching it, and it's those messages that are geared to children, but just like when you feel so mad you want to roar.
Right.
I mean, that's a message for every adult.
Oh, sure it is.
I mean, that is Fred's way of saying it was the song, when you feel so mad, what do you do when you feel so mad you want to bite?
Right.
I mean, so, it was repurposed to when you feel so mad you want to roar. Try something different. Going to the bathroom, all those child development little lessons that are incorporated in every single neighborhood program are very effective for parents in terms of messaging.
I think that's the beauty part of it. It works on both levels.
It does. It
and,
really does.
And I think if it didn't, a lot of parents would pay no attention to it.
That's true.
But instead they do.
Right.
And I think that's the magic of the whole Fred Rogers thing is that both adults and children are able to enjoy it on some level. But like you say, it takes adults a little while to figure it out, and best if they have kids.
Exactly.
Exactly. So, all right, let's talk about Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood for a moment, because that's been inordinately successful. That's been a very successful enterprise. Talk about how that came to be and how you developed it.
Well, there was a point in time where the board of the company, we decided that we wanted to get back into children's television. And we decided that, the format for Mr. Rogers was a format for one person. And it was not a format that if you didn't have a Fred Rogers type of personality, a Fred Rogers with a talent to write the music, write the scripts, do the puppeteering, do the on-air, be the facilitator. You couldn't use that.
You could
format
not franchise that show
at all.
There were no sequels to that show.
Right. So we thought about animation, and we then decided to bring somebody in, and we did a nationwide search and brought in Kevin Morrison.
How did you do that search? Did you do it through headhunters? Did you do it through?
We did it through a company here in Pittsburgh.
Okay.
And brought Kevin in, and had animation experience, had worked in children's television for a long period of time, came from L.A., and he really was he was the person that we relied on in his advice. We had known Angela. Angela Santamera had come to Pittsburgh, had met Fred on a number of occasions. We seriously looked at 3 different programs, and PBS and we liked Daniel Tiger the best, and that's the one we ran with.
Were there other programs that came to you that were Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood themed or based?
No, this is the only one that we really based on
On
Mr. Rogers'
a known Mr. Rogers
known
character.
Mr. Rogers character.
Sure.
We did it on a known Mr. Rogers character, and it's really the second generation. Daniel is the original Daniel Tiger's son. So Dad Tiger would have been Daniel Tiger on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Got it.
So the characters were all either nieces, nephews, sons, daughters of. And there was no adult at all, and they were 11-minute segments with interstitial something in the middle of it, an opening and a closing. It so happened that the person assigned from PBS to work with us was Paul Siefken, who we then hired to come in to run a company, and he now is the president and CEO of Fred Rogers Productions.
And that's how it works.
That's how it works. I mean, he was an incredibly gifted person, very smart, very knowledgeable about children's program, and worked at Cartoon Network and PBS.
How deeply were you involved in the development of the series itself, the show itself?
I
know you were not terribly into the creative end.
No, not even. Just in talking to make sure that the philosophy of Fred was consistent, because it really was based on his work.
No question.
So, people at the company, Margie Whitmer, who was a producer of The Neighborhood, Hedda Sherapin, who had been with Fred for many, many years, Kathy Droz, people really sat down and talked with Angela and worked with Angela. A lot of script reviewing. Also working with Roberta Schomburg, who is now the executive director of the Rogers Center in Latrobe as a child development person, really bringing in people who knew Fred's philosophy, who understood child development and understood what he stood for in terms of children's programming. So it is very much in tune with Fred's work.
So there were
that's Daniel Tiger.
Right. And so there definitely were childhood development specialists
Absolutely.
that were consultants or working on the show
Absolutely.
itself. And I don't think you could have done it any other way.
No, I don't think so either.
Because 25 years I wrote cartoons in Hollywood, and
Right.
believe me, there was nobody telling us from a child development standpoint what to do on 98% of what I worked on. And it was kind of free reign, and frankly, most of my working life was working on teenage boy, late before their 10s. So they were kind of violent and they were action-packed, and I worked on shows like Batman and X-Men, and they were violent shows. They were nothing like what you would see on
For a preschool child.
Right. And so, all right, so how long did it take to develop that show before you were ready to say, hey, we have a show here that, it's good to go on TV?
I would say probably, well, we had talked with Angela on and off. I mean, we had developed a relationship with her. So it was one of the 3 that we looked at. But I would say from the time they came up with a pilot and really worked it, PBS fast-tracked it. I mean, they wanted it. They liked the concept. They liked the Bible. They liked what they saw. It was probably about 3 years till it finally came on.
So I want the listeners to pay attention to what Bill just said, because I think it's going to surprise many people who don't know.
Doesn't happen overnight.
When you say they fast-tracked it, people will think, oh, they did it in about 3 months. No. Try 3 years.
Yeah. It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work, and there's a lot of work that goes into the back and forth of, should we do it this way or that way? Should we emphasize this or that? And there's a lot of that goes on, and some of it is guesswork, and some of it is better known.
Sure, and you know this. I mean, you're teaching this, but even looking for animators, we ended up working with 9 Story in Toronto. I mean, a lot of the animation is done in Canada these days.
Indeed.
And we took a look at a couple companies. I mean, it wasn't you just go someplace. I mean, you really have to feel comfortable with everybody you're working with. Collaborations are incredibly important to the success of a program.
So glad you brought that up.
But they are so tough. I would always say when we're getting into a collaboration, remember, this is going to be tough work. It is tough work. You've got to accept that. I would put it a little bit more graphically, but I can't say that on the air. I mean, I don't.
Well,
and
you wouldn't say it on the air, but the truth is this show has an adult rating, and you could if you wanted to.
But once it happens and it's successful like Daniel Tiger,
right,
it's a great story.
Sure.
But there's a lot of give and take.
Oh, you don't know whether it's going to succeed before you put it up on the air.
No idea.
You can guess all day long, and you can be 100% sure it's going to succeed and the thing will flop. That's just the nature of the entertainment industry at large.
But if you get people that you want to work with and that you trust, and trust is a big factor, and you're open and you're honest, you can produce something of value. And Daniel is a real example of that.
All right, for you, I'm going to ask you a question I ask a lot of guests it's a very difficult question. Mm-hmm. For you, what makes a good story good? Why is this story good and this one's rejected?
You know, I should be asking you that question. You're the person that spent their life writing.
I've heard many answers.
Well, you know what makes a good story a good story? It's a very personal thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like going back and reading a poem. Two people read a poem and they interpret it differently, right? Two people see something, they interpret it differently. You know, Fred used to say that space between the viewer's eyes and the television screen is hallowed ground, because that's where people are interpreting what they see, and they see it differently. I think what makes a story good is a very, very personal thing, and it doesn't really make you think, make you imagine, make you feel like you're part of it.
Does it draw you in?
It has to. And if it doesn't, it's not a good story.
Okay, so the way that works, and I think Fred Rogers was maybe the supreme example of it, you must, as an author, as a creator, you must engender empathy with that protagonist, that lead character.
Totally.
And I think there was probably no one who engendered empathy with what he was doing more than Fred did.
Right.
And I hesitate to say Fred because I didn't know him, and it feels
Please
disrespectful.
use it.
But Mr. Rogers, because that's how I grew up knowing Mr. Rogers. I think that you hit on it, and that it has to do with dragging the viewer on a personal level into your show.
Yeah.
And if you don't, and okay, so was that part of the conversation in any way on Daniel Tiger?
No, we knew that we're Daniel Tiger. I think the brilliance of Daniel Tiger was going to the next generation, so that you're dealing with adults, tigers, you know, adult characters,
right?
With a Mr. McFeely, with a Baker Acre, with a Music Man Stan, with Lady Elaine, and then Lady Elena, her daughter. The brilliance there was bringing in more than one generation, as you could do with a neighborhood. But if you would have just done Daniel Tiger, it would have been a single generation.
If the show had just been called Daniel Tiger,
and he only used Daniel, this idea of Angela's concept was let's go to the next generation.
Well, that's very Fred-like.
It is very Fred-like. It really is.
You're going to all these different entities and characters, and
sure. And then baby Margaret comes along, Daniel's little sister, who's named after Margaret McFarlane, is very Fred-like because all the characters in the neighborhood were named after people Fred knew. Daniel Tiger was named after Dorothy Daniel, who was the first general manager of WQED.
Interesting. I did not know that. Yeah. He liked to name things. I mean, Mr. McFeely comes from his grandfather, his family, right?
Yeah,
his grandfather.
Queen Sarah is Sarah Joanne Bird Rogers, his wife. So there was a lot of connection with the characters.
Clearly, it was very personal for him.
Incredibly personal.
Yeah, I mean, probably there's lots of things that nobody ever really knew what he was truly thinking because it was reminding him of one thing or another,
which he picked up in talking with people. I would always say that he would be talking to people, and a character would come or a story would come back in, It was his meeting of Francois Clemens. I mean, that became when he met Francois as a student, he said, "I think you should be on the neighborhood, and it'd be good to have you as a policeman." And Francois talks about it. I was a young student, and he, an African American. He wanted me to be a policeman. That was just unheard of.
Not in those days. That was unheard of.
But when you think about it, he really brought his life, how he saw life, and the people in his life to life on that screen via Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Very, very interesting. What would you say when you were in developing the show? Because after all, this show, StoryBeat, is about the process of various things. What would you say were the biggest, or maybe the biggest hurdle that you had to overcome? Was it raising the financing? Was it selling the show to getting PBS totally on board? What was the biggest hurdle?
Well,
and how did you overcome it?
It's really interesting. Once you have what I would call the broadcast slot, once PBS came on board,
right?
This community in the city of Pittsburgh, the region, has an incredibly generous foundation base, and the foundations really came forward, and it was not easy, but we were really supported by the foundations here in Pittsburgh.
So the development of money, the finding of production money, was a big hurdle.
It's absolutely a big
and
hurdle,
it always
because
is,
it's again, the neighborhood was a fairly inexpensive half hour compared to a half hour of animation. And talking about the broadcast standards that you need to have. We were also fortunate because we were able to get underwriting support from Rite Aid Corporation, the Bezos Foundation. So people began to see the value of the program, and underwriting came along and was very, very helpful also.
Well, without it, you have really next to nothing unless you're independently wealthy.
Exactly.
Obviously, there are humans in the world that could afford to fund a whole show like that, but they're not common.
No,
it's hard to get them to part with their money too.
No, it's tough. I mean, it is very difficult because it's an expensive endeavor, and when you're talking about doing 40 half hours, that is a lot of money.
All right, so let's then talk about it. You clearly must be pretty good at pitching in a way, whether it's the show itself or pitching the Fred Rogers Productions or company, or whatever what is your philosophy on pitching or selling, or however you want to call it?
Well, let me be really honest about this. Pitching a Mr. Rogers brand is not that difficult, especially today. I mean, this is not. We were not starting from scratch.
That's
we
true.
had a known quantity.
It's like when I worked at Disney and they were producing various duck shows. They were producing Winnie the Pooh. It's not a tough sell.
No, not at all. I mean, if you do Disney, you can do Disney on ice. You can do Disney on roller skates.
Yes.
You can do Disney on big trucks. I mean, you can do Disney on anything.
Was there ever a time when Fred Rogers wasn't as powerful a draw?
Well, here's where one of the little differences come in. Fred Rogers never was in it for the money. I mean, he saw it as ministry. So he was not interested in licensing or making money.
Right.
With Daniel, you have to put a whole licensing program together because what is called the back end really supports the continuation of the program and the producing of the program.
Right.
So any toys, any books, anything like that is important too. I mean, it is a total package. Tax credits. I mean, what goes into it, it's so many financing options. And again, having somebody like Kevin Morrison, who had been in the business and really understood long-term financing issues and short-term financing issues, really, really helped us. But the bulk of the funds to support Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood came from the city of Pittsburgh and a foundation base. PBS puts forth money too.
But they have a as my understanding is, PBS has a tendency to not put anywhere near as much money in as the bigger entities.
No. I mean, the difference between PBS and the other entities is PBS puts money in it and you own it. The other ones put a lot more money in it, but they own it.
But they own it.
Right.
Sure. Well, So PBS doesn't have any ownership at all in
They have
Daniel
a
Tiger?
percentage of receipts in the back end, but they don't.
But no
they don't have
ownership.
No,
No
the
copyright.
The copyright belongs totally to Fred Rogers Productions.
Isn't that great?
It is because it's a nonprofit and it's able to keep the productions going.
And I'm so happy to hear you say that most of the money for the show came out of Pittsburgh.
It did.
I think
It really did.
that says a lot about
It did.
Pittsburgh.
And even the new programs that are being produced, the foundations have realized that Fred Rogers Productions has done a lot for this city.
That is an uncontested truth.
And so it's great to have that kind of support. You can't minimize it.
It is. All right, so we've been talking we're heading toward an hour. Last two questions.
Sure.
You've obviously been doing this quite some time. You're now retired, but you
Right.
worked on TV and so on for at least 35 years or more. In all your experiences, and maybe particular with Mr. Rogers, can you relate to us a funny, quirky, offbeat, weird, strange story that's just delightful to hear?
Yeah, about Fred?
It can be about Fred or anything at all. It'd be great to hear something about Fred.
Well, this is Joanne Rogers' favorite story about Fred, and she tells it far better than I tell it. But Fred, when Fred was in a neighborhood, he wore a regular necktie.
Okay.
In real life, he wore a bow tie.
Really?
Self-tied. Anytime I had to go to a formal thing, I had to go over to his house to have him tie my necktie. I could never tie a bow tie. And Fred could do it without even looking in a mirror. And one day he was getting on an airplane, and he's walking up the ramp, and he sees the flight attendant smiling. And he gets right up to the woman, and the woman says, "I just love your popcorn." And he said, "I love popcorn too," and sits down. And she comes back after the plane takes off, and she said, "I am so sorry." And he said, "Don't be." Now, again, this is a generational thing because a lot of young people do not know who Orville Redenbacher was when he did his own program.
Sure.
So we called Fred Orville for about 6 months after that. But he had a great sense of humor. He did not, when she said, "I love your popcorn," he didn't say, "I'm not Orville."
Well,
He just, "I like popcorn too," and sat down.
when you're essentially egoless,
Yeah, exactly.
which he was, it's pretty easy to laugh at yourself. You're not going to get all caught up in it.
There's another one where someday he was at a function and somebody kept calling him Mr. Ed, and he said, "I can't believe they think I'm a horse." And the guy was with him said, "Yeah, but at least it's a talking horse." I mean, Fred did have a tremendous sense of humor. I mean, he really did, and he could laugh at himself, which was great. And he and Joanne had a whole language of their own, and their senses of humor were just brilliant. So I could tell a lot of Fred Rogers stories.
It just occurred to me. There's a question I need to ask you.
Sure.
From A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood.
Right.
Did you actually drive him out to meet with Tom Junod, who's played by made into the character Lloyd?
I'll tell you the exact setup because Tom Junod and I today are friends. We would consider ourselves friends because we talk. We talk probably. During the filming, we were talking probably once, twice a month. I just talked to him 2 weeks ago. I was not, Fred would get these requests, and he always made up his own mind. I mean, he would ask for advice. I was not hot on Tom Junod. He had a pretty rough reputation as a really rough investigative journalist for Esquire magazine, and he had done a really pretty tough story on an actor, and it had just come out. And I just said, I don't think it's necessary to do. It's a sidebar. It's 400 words. It's Michael Jordan is going to be on the cover. I mean, I just don't know why to do it. So he said, "Oh, I think I should do it." It sounds like he sounds like a nice person. Am I talking to him? So on a Friday afternoon, he said, "I just got off the phone with Tom Junod. He's coming in Sunday," and I told him Joanne and I would have dinner. "Do you want to join us?" And I said, "Absolutely not." And he came in Monday morning, and Fred would never say, "I told you so." He always said, "You never know. You are going to love him. He is really a decent human being." And I just, my eyes just glassed over. It's Fred always being positive about everybody. And he came in, and, it wasn't rude, but, when he came back and he wanted to go to Latrobe, yeah, I drove. I drove up with him.
Huh.
And
So what we see in the movie is based on that reality.
it is the differences and the reason the character's name, Lloyd Vogel, is for drama, which you understand again as a
Yes.
writer and a storyteller. He never got into a fight with his father at his sister's wedding. There was never a sister's wedding. I mean,
That's
you
drama-
have to build the
dramatized.
drama in, right?
Sure.
But in terms of the relationship and the growth of the relationship, that is all true. And I would say of anybody that ever interviewed Fred, and Fred maintained relationships with a lot of people, he never retained the intense relationship that he had with Tom until
Really?
the day he died.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, they really did correspond back and forth.
Huh.
And Tom has gone back, really, got into the hard drive of his old computer and everything else to really bring a lot of stuff back. He's not doing a book about it. He just really wanted to relive a lot of those things.
Well, okay, so again, I've gotten slightly off
No,
topic,
that's
but
okay.
it's a really good topic, and that is almost all memorable, popular drama, comedy, it doesn't matter what it is requires being filled with nothing but conflict, which is what A Beautiful
Right.
Day in the Neighborhood has, tons
Sure.
of conflict. And yet, so the miracle of Mr. Rogers is he made 900 episodes of shows with almost no conflict in
Right.
it. How do you do that? Because it's almost impossible.
Yeah. There were tads of conflict in it, I mean,
Sure.
with the king always being the imperial highness, always
Yes.
wanting to be in charge.
But it was never. But it's not conflict filled.
No, you're right. You're right.
That was the beauty part
Yeah,
of it. Okay,
no, you're right.
Last question, Bill. We've been talking to. I've been talking to Bill Eisler. See, I use the pronoun. I do it all the time.
We all do. It's amazing how we to think of ourselves
In the first position.
in the first position, and Fred always thought of it's always we.
Interesting. So I've been talking to Bill Eisler here for close to an hour, and the last question of the day is, do you have a solid piece of advice or a tip that you can lend to those that are starting out in the entertainment industry, in TV, that will hold them in good stead, or perhaps it's someone that's in but trying to get to that next level? Either way.
I got to go back to what I said before, Steve, and I think this is really important, and just hearing you talk about teaching, you've got to feel passionate about what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to be willing to accept failure as part of the learning process.
Oh, boy, do you.
Learning is all about failure. We can't avoid failure. It happens. But what we have to do with that failure is turn it into the positive.
Mm-hmm.
And none of this happens overnight for anybody.
For anybody, for sure.
I don't care who they are.
Nobody comes out of the womb a success.
No. And nobody becomes the competent human being in and by themselves.
Oh no, that's 100%.
So this
100%
process of really being able to accept failure for what it is and turn it into the positive, I think is really something you have to do, because you're going to meet people that are going to be really rude and potentially mean, and you can't let that affect who you are and what you're trying to do.
Well, because if it does, you're pretty much out
You're
of
done.
the business.
You're done.
And a lot of people aren't able to weather that, and so they fade away.
Right.
And only the people who, not only, but mostly the people who are able to weather those brickbats that come at you, are able to then succeed.
Right. If I may take a little bit of the movie. Micah and Noah, who were the two screenwriters, when we met them, they would tell you it was probably an 8-year process from the meeting to when they got the final script.
That makes sense.
Because originally we said no to the first script that they submitted. We weren't interested. They came back, spent some time in the archives, and they said, we have to do this movie. Then get us a script that we think is going to be workable and true to life. But, Mari Heller, who's a director, this was her third film. Her second was Can You Ever Forgive Me, which Kathleen Bates was nominated last year for an Academy Award. Again, in this business, no women directors were nominated this year for an Academy Award.
It's a bit of a puzzle.
So when you think about that, Mari is not sitting in New York moaning and groaning. She's out doing more great stuff.
100 has to be.
And you got to be that way. I mean, she'll tell you, I don't think a woman will be nominated this year. I just don't think it just isn't going to happen. But it's not going to slow the woman down. She's still doing great work.
And And one must.
Yeah, and Hanks is another good example. I mean, everybody looks at Tom Hanks at 63, great guy. How many Oscars? How many nominations? How many failures, and how long did it take him to get there?
Long time. Well, he hit it pretty young.
He did,
but
he worked pretty hard.
But he's worked very hard. Most successes are not overnight, and most successes are fraught with failures of all kinds.
And you just got to keep going.
That is 100% true. If you see a beautiful day in the neighborhood, take a look at the Chinese restaurant scene, everybody, because if you're paying attention in that scene are Mrs. Rogers, Bill Eisler, and David Newell.
Right.
Is there anybody else in that scene?
Margie Whitmer is in it, and Hedda Sherapan is in it. It was all the people. They chose people, the producers chose people who worked directly with Fred, who they thought should be in it. And
well, that's pretty cool.
It is really.
And that restaurant happens to be one door away from where we're recording this show,
right,
in downtown Pittsburgh. And it's a phenomenal movie, and I urge everyone to check it out, and to check out all of the shows of the Fred Rogers Company, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, Peg and Cat, and Odd
Squad.
Odd Squad, correct.
Soon, Don Quixote will be in, I think, 2021.
Is that right?
On PBS, which is another spinoff from the neighborhood, another character in the neighborhood coming to life.
Really?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
In cooperation with Spiffy Productions, who have a program called Nature Cat, who've really worked with the Henson people for years. So it's a puppet program.
Oh,
it's going to be great. It's really going to be good.
That'll be fun.
I do want to say something, because you're somebody who came back from L.A., and you think L.A., you think New York, you think Hollywood. Everybody who had anything to do with this film absolutely fell in love with the city of Pittsburgh.
How could they not?
Yeah, I mean, there are just great stories about this. And if I may tell one other that's also generational, but Tom Hanks, to set the stage, was born in Oakland, California, and he was a huge Oakland Raiders fan growing up. So he came in with his 22-year-old son, Truman, who was just graduating from college, the first time to come in for hair, makeup, and sound. And he was staying at the Fairmont. And he gets on the elevator, and the bellman says, "I hear you're making a movie about Mr. Rogers." And he said, "We are." And he said, "Well, we take Mr. Rogers very seriously in this town." And Tom said, "I just backed up to the back of the elevator and just didn't say anything." And we get to the top floor, and he says, the bellman says, "But Mr. Hanks, we gave you the best suite in the hotel. We gave you the Franco Harris suite." And he said, there was no way I was going to tell him I didn't like Franco Harris. And his son says, why wouldn't you like Franco Harris? He said, the Immaculate Reception. He said, what's the Immaculate Reception? I mean, it was a generational thing. But Franco did get to meet him. But, Hanks loved his city, every bit about it. And he did come back after the massacre. He came back for the events.
Yes, I know.
They made sure that there was a showing in Squirrel Hill for the families and the responders.
And I think that's a testament to who he is.
Exactly.
And I think
he really identified with his city.
And I don't think that anyone could have ever found a better actor for that, as both a human being and an actor.
It's frightening when you see him come out for the first time.
Just the first time I can remember the first time seeing a photograph of him sitting on the steps
of the trailer.
That was the first photo they released, and I thought, holy moly, he really looks a lot like Mr. Rogers. I mean, he's obviously Tom Hanks.
No, he's not. It's not an imitation. It's a portrayal, which is another thing about your business that is really amazing.
It is what I like.
I think it's better.
It is what I like to call an impression.
I like that.
It's not an impersonation. It's an impression.
Yeah, and it's much better.
It is much better.
Hey, listen, thanks.
Bill,
you do great work. It's great to have you back in the city, especially at Point Park.
Thank you. It has just been a true delight to have you in the studio. I greatly appreciate Bill Eisler being with us.
See you on the streets.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great episodes to you. This podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.